Hey everybody, this is the final chapter of Praxis, Marxist Criticism and Dissent in Socialist Yugoslavia. It's titled Conclusion, the Intellectual and Social Responsibility. Quote, "You should judge. To that end you have been given your eyes and your understanding. ... We humanists have all of us a pedagogic itch. Humanism and schoolmasters, there is a historical connection between them, and it rests upon psychological fact. The office of schoolmaster should not, cannot, be taken away from the humanist, and for the tradition of the beauty and dignity of man rests in his hands. The priest, who in troubled and inhuman times arrogated to himself the office of guide to youth, has been dismissed. Since when, my dear sirs, no special type of teacher has arisen," end quote. And that's from a character, I guess, Settembrini, in Thomas Mann's book, The Magic Mountain. Since 1945, Yugoslavia has been in a state of constant and at times dramatic social change, regardless of the formal continuity of political leadership at the highest level. Indeed, the rapid progression in the past 30 years of substantive constitutional changes, and even of new constitutions, has been merely the formal expression of more far-reaching changes in general social structure. It is only natural, moreover, to expect that social changes of such magnitude should be accompanied by the erosion of old values and symbols and the articulation of new ones. But while the Yugoslav ruling political stratum has responded to structural change and dislocation in a relatively flexible manner, and has even been responsible for many highly imaginative new approaches in the institutional sphere, its ability to respond to change in the sphere of cultural values has been somewhat less impressive. While the party leadership did assume the early responsibility for destroying isolated aspects of the Stalinist theoretical system, as part of its more profound restructuring of the Yugoslav polity, the task of formulating a new integrated worldview adequate to the new concept of democratic self-managing socialism fell to professional academics, philosophers, and sociologists. Over the years, these theorists did indeed develop a new worldview, but one which rejected in its entirety the very core of the old ideological system, which served as the basis for a highly authoritarian society. That paradoxical blend of metaphysics and coarse pragmatism known as, quote, dialectical materialism. The new worldview, based on a profoundly Marxist humanist vision of man liberated from all forms of alienation, carried its proponents by its own internal logic from a critique of theory to a critique of practice, of the party, bureaucracy, and social structure within Yugoslavia. Resistance from traditionally minded official sources only served to strengthen the resolve of the new critics to confront the pressing social issues of the day with a keener eye and with the total honesty that they felt befitted the intellectual and socialist society. Yet for all this, Praxis, which became the mouthpiece of the Yugoslav Marxist humanist intelligentsia, never did become, the claims of its detractors notwithstanding, the core of an outright oppositional political movement. Instead, the Praxis experience may perhaps more sensibly be viewed as a particularly vigorous reappearance of the classical intelligentsia, so important to the history of Eastern Europe in particular, in the modern context. To appreciate the historical significance of the intelligentsia, it may be useful to have reference to two alternative models of intellectual activity. In one model characteristic of the, quote, sociology of knowledge, and, quote, school of analysis, the intellectual is seen in the more or less passive role of, quote, guardian of truth, and, quote, whose separation from the sphere of social action is understood as being desirable both for the integrity of the intellectual and for the good of society as a whole. A second model, more typically employed in historical analysis, presents the intellectual as dedicated by virtue of the historical context in which he lives to certain ideas of social justice and human dignity, which have been only incompletely realized in the course of his society's development and to whose realization he is committed. On closer inspection, these models may in turn correspond broadly to two different types of societies, The first, to societies in which change is gradual or at least contained and where there exists a broad consensus about the pace and boundaries of change. The second, to societies where cultural development is for one reason or another permitted to run far ahead of changes in social structure, and where inadequacies in the latter become increasingly intolerable with the passage of time. It is societies of the second type that are prone to give birth to intelligentsias, conscious collectivities of intellectuals that formulate and articulate the ideals of the age to the rest of society and urge their immediate realization. The institution which most adequately accommodates the role of the intellectual in the first type of society in the modern age is the university, for the intelligentsia which finds itself in the midst of profound processes of social change. A variety of forms can mediate between it and society at large. The circle, the journal, the newspaper, the political party, or even the conspiratorial organization, depending upon the diverse factors giving rise to the intelligentsia in each instance, and upon the extent to which the intelligentsia has had the opportunity to develop as an independent social force. Throughout their history, the subjective identity of the Praxis Marxists as intellectuals was an important factor in their self-definition with respect to the society in which they lived. As they were progressively excluded from officially sanctioned forums, their gaze turned inward and they became increasingly preoccupied with the question of the intelligentsia and its role in the post-revolutionary society. Their numerous writings on this theme testify to the depth of their concern and moreover offer us a valuable insight into their collective personality and goals. Therefore, in this concluding chapter, we shall discuss the Praxis view of the intelligentsia in the modern world and try to assess the effectiveness of Praxis itself as an instrument of intellectual criticism in a socialist society. New section, the concept of a humanist intelligentsia. The heightened importance of the, quote, man of knowledge, end quote, in the contemporary world, Rudy Supek argues, is to a large extent the product of the growth of industrial society. While such societies may assume varied political forms, they exhibit certain common sociological characteristics, such as the growth of the tertiary sector, the demand for higher qualifications in all occupations, the increased significance of research, and consequently the demand for increased levels of training and education. Education becomes a primary factor in social stability. Lipset and Dobson connect similar observations with the further assertion that, quote, certain features inherent in the role and social organization of intellectual life give rise to critical activity, end quote. And that, quote, the rising prestige of the institutions of knowledge production and creative intellectuals, along with the interdependence between these social units and other key institutional structures, leads to the rapid diffusion of critical ideas and values, thereby amplifying the impact of such activity. End quote. Seymour Martin Lipset and Richard B. Dobson's article, The Intellectual as Critic and Rebel, with special reference to the United States and the Soviet Union, published in Dallas, summer 1972. While this latter line of argument seems to account persuasively enough for the growth of intellectual dissidence in modern society, it does little to account for resistance to such movements of dissent, without which, indeed, words such as, quote, dissent and, quote, criticism would pertain only to empty categories. Again, setting aside important differences in political structures, it is possible to argue that much of the critical initiative emanating from the university may be fundamentally at odds with the ethos, if not the goals, of industrial expansion, which through its seemingly insatiable demand for ever higher levels of technical sophistication and training has in Lipset and Dobson's view so enhanced the prestige of the university. The very, quote, interdependence of which Lipset and Dobson speak between, quote, institutions of knowledge production and, quote, key institutional structures, end quote, may in fact constitute reason for pessimism rather than optimism about the future of intellectual dissent in the modern world. One of the most common fallacies in the study of intellectual movements seems to lie in the simplistic assumption that the, quote, intelligentsia can be conceived of as a more or less homogeneous homogeneous social category consisting of all people engaged in those professions which demand the application of mental rather than physical skills. In fact, no assumption can be more misleading. In the modern world, the man of learning is as often the legitimator of accepted social values and practices as he is a skeptic. Certainly in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, this is no less true than anywhere else. A corollary fallacy seems to be that the quote, intellectual professions have a uniform tendency to generate critical intellectuals, regardless of the proximate concerns of each individual field of study. To be sure, the quote, democratic movement, end quote, in the USSR seems to provide grounds for such an assertion, drawing on professional scientists as well as on writers, artists, and scholars in the humanities, but to offer the Soviet intelligentsia as a paradigmatic case would be to overlook the very peculiarities of Soviet society, above all the imposition of strict regulation in all fields of intellectual endeavor, which have generated an intelligentsia that has been able to focus on the very minimum conditions of all intellectual activity, the freedom of inquiry and expression. With respect to Eastern Europe, however, Francois Faito has evidently extrapolated from the Soviet case, arguing that it is, quote, the technological intelligentsia and the scientific and literary elite, end quote, which is the major force behind reform and economic development. Faito is thus led to reduce the goals of these distinct groups to the following oversimplified assertion, quote, the main argument of the revisionists, from the Potofi Circle in Hungary to the Praxis group in Yugoslavia and the Polish periodical Pro Prusto to the Czechoslovak Litarni Novini, is that neither the working class nor its vanguard, the party, nor even the vanguard's vanguard, the quote, new class, unquote, are equipped to manage a modern industrial society efficiently, end quote. Faito. For the Praxis Marxists, at least, efficiency is actually only a secondary concern bowing before the larger issues of human fulfillment and equality. While they are certainly not alone in holding this conviction, the skepticism of the Praxis Marxists towards efficiency as a social value is considerably more marked than that of most intellectuals living in the neighboring countries of Eastern Europe. This fact itself doubtless reflects the unusual origins of Praxis Marxism as well as the unique nature of Yugoslav socioeconomic development with respect to the rest of the socialist world. At best a means to the higher goals of the elimination of misery and alienation for all men, efficiency, it is the Praxis contention, all too often takes the place of these ends in the minds of technocrat and bureaucrat alike, who view human beings as mere objects to be manipulated for the sake of higher production figures or for the ambiguous aim of, quote, social control. There is a sober awareness in Praxis theory that increased technological sophistication and industrial output are not in themselves sufficient conditions for the development of a more just and humane society, even though they may be vitally necessary for the achievement of the material abundance which can bring such a society closer to realization. In many Praxis essays, the confrontation between the ethic of efficiency and the ethic of self-realization has been personified in a conflict between two categories of intellectuals, the technical intelligentsia and the humanistic intelligentsia. The former terms seem to apply in occupational terms to natural scientists, engineers, managers, functionaries, and all those involved in the generation and application of techniques of manipulation and control, be it of the physical or of the human world. The, quote, humanistic intelligentsia, end quote, on the other hand, is composed of workers in the arts and humanities whose primary activity involves the articulation and evaluation of cultural symbols and the general quality of social life. Perhaps the most radical distinction between the two is made by Tadich, who focuses simultaneously on the social role and the nature of knowledge sought by each. The technical intelligentsia, he writes, quote, is situated in a social climate created by bourgeois society, ... Its exact rational knowledge is legitimized either on the basis of its application in immediate production and for technical ends or of its useful commitment to the provision of various social services, ... Being situated in a wage relationship similar to that of the bureaucracy and the natural scientific and technical intelligentsia serves the mechanism of industrial competition and social service, while attractive rewards and the nature of work make it indifferent toward all that happens in social life, end quote. Tadich. But, quote, writers and philosophers, Tadich continues, quote, are in a different position. Despite the peculiar type of rigor involved in its manner of thinking, this type of intelligentsia is, quote, handicapped by the fact that it cannot put its knowledge directly to profitable use. This is the source of its difficulty in achieving equal status and acknowledgement in modern society, ... The role of writers and philosophers in this sense is primarily negative and destructive rather than positive and creative, end quote. Tadich. Certainly in the historical context of industrializing and industrialized societies, this distinction between two intelligentsias, one positivist in outlook, the other by definition critical, is on the surface quite appealing, but on closer scrutiny it becomes untenable in this severe form. What sense can it make, for instance, of the scientist with a, quote, social conscience, end quote, or the historian who writes textbooks celebrating the present? While such examples, to be sure, can be found in Western societies, the question becomes all the more pressing when we consider the problem of intellectual dissent in countries such as the Soviet Union. Indeed, in that society, where the fields of the natural and precise sciences are most immune from the direct imposition of political standards, the scientific intelligentsia has been in the forefront of the dissident movement. As Lipset and Dobson observe, it was three physicists, Sakharov, Tverdok, Lebov, and Chelidze, who in 1970 established the Moscow Committee for Human Rights in an attempt to bring some manner of coordination and unified purpose to the movement's most often disparate activities. And as Sakharov himself tells us in his brief preface to Progress, Coexistence, and Intellectual Freedom, quote, the views of the author were formed in the milieu of the scientific and scientific technological intelligentsia, which manifests much anxiety over the principles and specific aspects of foreign and domestic policy and over the future of mankind. This anxiety is nourished in particular by a realization that the scientific method of directing policy, the economy, arts, education, and military affairs still has not become a reality, end quote. Andrei D. Sakharov in the book Progress, Coexistence, and Intellectual Freedom, published in 1968 in New York. The almost naive faith expressed in this passage in the capacity of science to resolve the problems of the world is what many Praxis Marxists find most suspect in the claims of the technical intelligentsia. As Tadich points out, quote, the progress of technique and of science resting on technique is not equivalent to human progress, end quote. Životich, in particular, takes Sakharov to task for holding, quote, a technocratic vision of the future founded on the belief in the unlimited power of science, ... in which the two superpowers will undertake an organized struggle for, quote, geo-hygiene, end quote, for a higher standard of living, for the solution of the famine problem, etc., ... An affluent society might emerge, but in the framework of the existing bureaucratic structures, it would be a society without personal freedoms, end quote. Životich. In the article, The End of Ideals or of Ideology. In reply to Zhitovich's later contentions, it suffices simply to point to the adamant insistence of Sakharov and other like-minded Soviet intellectuals, scientists, for instance, like Zhores, Medvedev, and Tverdok Lebov, it's my best guess, and others, on the freedom of thought, the elimination of censorship and police repression, and the exposure of Stalinism, in order to demonstrate their radical aversion to, quote, the existing bureaucratic structures, unquote, and their commitment to individual freedom. The suspicion lingers, however, that Sakharov's advocacy of the freedom of thought is at least generically derived from its abiding belief in the power of science, and, what is more disturbing, that many of his scientific colleagues might well be content with a freedom of thought limited to the scientific community itself. For the mainstream of the, quote, democratic movement, end quote, however, the urge for the freedom of scientific inquiry seems to have merged with the strivings of other intellectuals to a point where the particular claims of each group have become nearly indistinguishable from the whole. If sense is still to be made of the distinction between the, quote, humanist and, quote, technical intelligentsias, perhaps it should be sought not so much in the nature of the intellectual's professional interest as in the relationship of the intellectual to his labor. Any occupation, Supek stresses, is, quote, technical, end quote, if it involves merely the application of a means or a method to a predetermined end defined independently of the immediate producer. Indeed, he argues, quote, there are purely, quote, technical occupations, end quote, in all the humanistic and social sciences, these occupations being defined by the limited nature of their research arrangements and the diverse application of scientific discoveries. End quote. Supek. The decisive factor, Supek concludes, is the nature of the relation of the producing subject to the object, process, and outcome of intellectual production. Quote, the human intelligentsia possesses a developed sense which links human creativity, regardless of whether it lies in the field of natural, social, or technical science, with the goals of the creativity, and accordingly it possesses a sense of personal responsibility in the formation of human conditions of life. The humanist intelligentsia has a certain, quote, relation of craftsmanship, end quote, toward its work, which is to say that it takes account of all phases of production, conceptualization, conduct, and application, The technical intelligentsia, on the other hand, is a typical product of industrial society, a developed division of labor, a routine relationship towards one's own production. It does not ask itself about the totality of its production, but only about the phase for which it is immediately responsible, abandoning personal responsibility for the goals of the person who issues the orders, and concerned only with fulfilling the order according to norms of quality, end quote. Supek. Whether the scientist or the philosopher is more inclined to assume this sense of responsibility now becomes a secondary concern, for as we have seen, the issue can be argued either way under different social and political conditions. The hallmark of the, quote, true intellectual, end quote, becomes the sense of obligation to examine ends as well as means, and the refusal to be content with the greater sophistication of technique and method as the sole and end of one's own activity. Footnote. See also Mihailo Markovich's essay, Ethics of a Critical Social Science, in his The Contemporary Marx. End footnote. For the communist intellectual in particular, any other ethic would represent a betrayal of responsibility, an act of concession to those who possess the resources which enable them to impose their own goals on the rest of society. In Nebojsa Popov's words, quote, to be undefined means to be on the side of the stronger, end quote. Footnote. Quote, there are no clerks, end quote, Sartre writes, quote, among the oppressed. Clerks are necessarily the parasites of oppressing classes or races, end quote. Sartre, which is literature, end footnote. By the same token, By the same token, there is no inherent reason in the Praxis view why each member of the social organism in a socialist society cannot possess the critical consciousness characteristic of the humanist intelligentsia. Indeed, the entire Praxis theory of socialism departs from the premise that the right of criticism is a necessary feature of any developed socialist society, for it is only by exercising this right that the individual, no matter what is placed in the social division of labor, can begin to exercise his full powers and responsibilities as an autonomous decision maker, equal to the challenge of self-management in all areas of social life. This critical spirit, however, does not arise spontaneously nor under all social conditions. It is this important point, in fact, which is at the core of the Praxis critique of the situation of the Yugoslav working class. It would be well, therefore, and completely in the spirit of the Praxis, quote, critique of the all existing conditions, unquote, to observe that with Karl Mannheim that, quote, it is not until we have a general democratization of the rise, that the rise of the lower strata allows their thinking to acquire public significance, end quote. Karl Mannheim in Ideology and Utopia. There are special circumstances, however, under which the effects of social structure on ideas can be reversed. One such circumstance is to be found in the existence of a strong, self-conscious intelligentsia, which has assumed as its mission the preservation and articulation of the ideals of a social movement. In this situation, the intellectual can become the, quote, living leaven that leads an economically conditioned revolt to consciousness of the class and historical mission of the proletariat, end quote. The, quote, spark, end quote, as Lenin might have put it. But what Lenin failed to understand in the profound organizationally motivated suspicion of the independent intellectual was that the revolutionary intellectual cannot play this catalytic role for long with any significant degree of success without the essential preconditions of free thought and expression within the revolutionary movement itself. Otherwise, what may begin as a revolutionization of consciousness may end tragically in an educational dictatorship. Footnote: this is one reason why Supek applauded so strongly the 1966 resolution of the French Communist Party, recognizing the importance of freedom of creativity for intellectuals as of significance, quote, not only for the strategy of the workers' movement, but also for the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. Rudy Supek, 1966. The intellectual, like Sartre's writer, quote, gives society a guilty conscience, end quote, revealing society to itself, quote, as seen, end quote, but can do so only so long as those in power can afford the luxury of considering their own complicity. And that quote is from Sartre's, what is literature? New section, Praxis as an institution. To the casual observer, the ability of Praxis to have survived for over 10 years in an increasingly hostile domestic environment must seem comprehensible only in the light of the remarkable courage and tenacity displayed by its individual contributors and the relatively open nature of the Yugoslav political system in the years between 1964 and 1975. It would certainly be impossible to deny the importance of either factor, yet there is also little doubt that without strong bonds of personal friendship and a common awareness of the identity of their concerns and of their fate, the Praxis Marxists would not have enjoyed such success in testing the limits of the Yugoslav system, and would probably each have found his or her own individual efforts drowned quickly in a sea of personal tragedy. The face that they presented to the world was one of a fellowship of philosophers and sociologists, all-powerful theorists in their own right and intellectually responsible only to themselves, who, while they must be read and understood individually, collectively compensated for each other's weaknesses, both personal and professional. While it is possible to view the group as a whole as consisting of various roles, these roles were played naturally without the prescribed behavior patterns and sanctions for deviance characteristic of the great majority of social institutions. There were those such as Petrovich, Kongrega, Tadic, Markovic, Stojanovic, Krejic, and Grilic, who viewed themselves as dedicated primarily to the pursuit of philosophy, but for whom philosophy was a way of seeing the world, but for whom philosophy as a way of seeing the world made urgent demands on that world and on the philosopher as an individual. Sociologists such as Rudy Supek, Kovacic, Popov, and Pesic were from the for whom the analysis of society cannot be approached independently of human perspectives and values. Provocateurs such as Stoyanovich, Grilich, Popov, Životich, and occasionally Kongoga, and men of caution at various times Supik, Vranitzky, Markovich, and Petrovich, and not least importantly those such as Danko Grilich, whose faculty for wit and jest often enlivened discussions and cooled heated passions. Their diversity, to be sure, often generated very serious internal disagreements in theory and in practice, the latter often being manifested, for instance, in varying degrees of commitment to the student cause. By the same token, it was this very diversity which permitted their response to attacks on their common symbol, the journal Praxis, to be extremely flexible and at times evasive. Their peculiar unity of theory and practice is much the result of a union of independent personalities and temperaments as of unity achieved within each personality was probably the most important key to the success of their common undertaking. Thus, if Praxis is to be thought of as a kind of social institution, an institution of social criticism, this was a very special kind of institution indeed. While there were always two individuals nominally designated as co-editors-in-chief of the journal, all important editorial decisions were made on the basis of strict collectivity at weekly meetings of the editorial board. And while certain individuals, particularly Gayo Petrovich, may have invested far more personal effort and time in the journal than others to the point of experiencing a deep sense of personal identification with the journal, at no time was it possible to identify the journal with the views or personality of any single individual. For Praxis was an institution without leaders, or perhaps more accurately, an institution consisting only of leaders. It was an institution small enough to be based primarily on ties of personal friendship of long standing, one in which collaboration, free from jealousy and suspicion, was organic and spontaneous rather than enforced. It was an institution whose dogma consisted in the struggle against all dogmatism, and whose chief object was to make itself superfluous by dissolving the concerns of the professional intellectual into the critical consciousness of the public at large. Peter Gay's description of the nature of association among the philosophes of the French Enlightenment is remarkably applicable to the Praxis Marxists as well. He calls the philosophes a, quote, philosophic family, end quote, who, quote, did not have a party line, but, were a party, Moreover, harassment or the fear of harassment drove the philosophes to remember what they had in common and forget what divided them. The report of a book banned, a radical writer imprisoned, a heterodox passage censored was enough, Critics trying to destroy the movement only strengthened it, end quote. Peter Gay. In the book, The Enlightenment and Interpretation. Indeed, the Praxis Marxists, like the philosophes, were unquestionably at their best when under attack. Instead of lowering themselves to the level of everyday political declamation and insinuation, they insisted on maintaining a consistent tenor of reasoned and public discourse. To defend themselves against charges of making politically suspect and, quote, alarming assertions, they took refuge in the argument that their statements were, quote, only theoretical, end quote. Although, as suggested in earlier discussions, their view of, quote, theory was a uniquely dynamic one, lending itself to flexible, if at times facile, interpretation, and certainly the persecution of a colleague, even for the expression of views with which they may have profoundly disagreed, as in the case of Mihailo Diurich, never failed to evoke among the Praxis Marxists a united front and a redoubled sense of common commitment. These various reactions may sensibly be viewed as mechanisms directed towards protecting the integrity of a common undertaking. When a collectivity begins to act in such a way, it becomes possible to speak in terms of institutional self-preservation. In the above pages, however, it has often been asserted that Praxis was not only an institution, it was a political institution. If this is true, then it would seem appropriate to determine the political program advocated by the Praxis Marxists. And at this point we abruptly discover that Praxis had no single political program to offer. Some observers of the Yugoslav scene have in fact perceived the absence of such a prescription for action as a vital flaw. William Dunn, for instance, has spoken of, quote, an inability among humanists to articulate a program which will reconcile and integrate self-management and some system for the cultural direction of socialist development. End quote. William Dunn. On the other hand, it has been argued from within the Praxis group that for the left to have a defined program would be for it to establish reified goals for the future, which would then tend to dictate certain predetermined courses of action, creating a fundamental contradiction between the practice of the movement and that free activity which is, quote, the substance of the new world, end quote, and the true goal of the left as a social movement. Footnote: for the sake of accuracy, it should be noted that all Praxis Marxists shared this view over the years. At a meeting of the editorial board held at the 1972 session of the Korčula Summer School, a heated discussion arose between Grilic and Supek. Supek, having come to the conclusion that the articulation of a distinct political program was finally a necessity. Grilic, on the other hand, continued to protest that such a course of action would be suicidal and would violate the very emancipatory consciousness to the cultivation of which Marxists must be dedicated. No resolution to this debate, it is nearly superfluous to say, was reached, from personal notes, from personal notes of the author, in parentheses. Whichever view may be correct in the long run, it is well to point out that the longevity of Praxis itself was at least partially attributable to the fact that Praxis's adherents were never so insensitive to their immediate political environment as to attempt to present a common set of concrete political objectives, even if this had been possible. To do so would have been to divest themselves of their sanctuary in the realm of theoretical criticism and to step out irrevocably onto the slippery ground of politics, as that art is understood by the practitioners of power. This is not to say, however, that individual Praxis Marxists did not advocate specific changes in the world of political institutions. Stoyanovich and Tadic, for instance, repeatedly focused their attention on the party as normatively composed of people who represent, quote, the most advanced and resolute section, end quote, of the proletarian movement, who have, quote, no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole, end quote. Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto. It might be noted in this connection that neither Stoyanovich nor Tadic, and this is true of their colleagues as well, have embraced any notion of a pluralist or multi-party political system based on the concept of the direct representation of social interest. Indeed, this is most clearly the point at which the Praxis Marxists have explicitly distinguished themselves from Gillas's political thought. Tadic, for instance, rejects the, quote, institutionalized, quote, petrified pluralism of bourgeois democracy, end quote, in the same breath as he rejects Stalinism. Both he maintains assure the reign of reified political forms over and against the real political community. Similarly, Stoyanovich's entire critique of group-dominated decision-making in the economic sphere certainly implies the rejection of pure pluralism as a structural principle, as inconsistent with the basic goals of socialist democracy. Elsewhere, he has observed that in a practical sense as well, multi-partyism would generate a very tenuous political situation in Yugoslavia, since it would certainly result in the crystallization of national enmities along formal political lines, and even legalize the formation of both pro-Stalinist and pro-bourgeois parties. Such a, quote, inter-party struggle for power in Yugoslavia, end quote, Stoyanovich cautions, would result in political instability, quote, which would in turn imperil further democratization, ... A multi-party system in Yugoslavia as it is today would most probably be only to the advantage of the most treacherous statist forces, and would develop them to strike a blow under the pretext of, quote, saving the revolution, end quote. Stoyanovich, Between Ideals and Reality, available on this channel. Indeed, nowhere else than in their ideas about alternative political models is it so clear that the thought of the Praxis Marxist lies squarely within the bounds of communist political culture, although with the passage of time they did move perceptibly further away from positions acceptable to ruling elites. In the pre-1968 period, the Praxis Marxists tended to concentrate on more traditional and they felt more fruitful issues such as democratic relations and the presence of criticism and genuine working class representation within the party itself. A Praxis editorial from 1968 was unambiguous on this score, reading in part, quote, "We consider that outside of or alongside of a Marxist communist ideological basis and perspective, outside of or alongside of the program of the LCY, there exists today no ideological political force capable of safeguarding the integrity of this country. Secondly, the problem of socialism is not and cannot be the dilemma of a one-party or multi-party system, but rather the question of the character and role of the proletarian party." End quote. Footnote. Oh, and also that quote was from a Praxis editorial. And there's a footnote. Footnote. It is worth while to read this passage further. Quote, "The party cannot be its own end, and as is sometimes believed, it is rather the function and the self-organization of class consciousness and proletarian consciousness, communist and socialist, of which the ultimate perspective is the disappearance of its own class self-organization and of its conscious self-organization in the form of the party, ... Criticism and self-criticism within the party itself and toward its own activity is the strongest weapon of the proletarian party in the struggle for the self-emancipation of the proletariat." End quote. Stoyanovich. Wait, no, that's not Stoyanovich. That's just like the Praxis editorial. Praxis editorial. End footnote. After the crucial year 1968, the Praxis Marxists generally grew more openly critical of the party, taking it openly to task for not having outgrown its authoritarian origins. By 1975, only Verninsky and the young, I don't know, there's a typo here, I think it's something Arko, Puhovsky, retained their party membership, others having renounced it or having been deprived of it in the preceding years. Yet not even this bitterly disappointing experience led the Praxis Marxists to renounce all personal ties with party officials or to deter many of them from their obsession with the concept of the party, much less to embrace alternative modes of political organization. This latter reluctance was surely a function of the genuine skepticism of many Praxis thinkers toward all forms of institutionalized political activity as adequate vehicles for the free, creative, and critical spirit of human praxis. In their rejection of bourgeois liberalism as well as party dogmatism in the name of the proletarian movement, they should perhaps be thought of not as deriving so much from the tradition of Nagy, or something, like as in like Imre Nagy. I think it's how you pronounce it is Nagy. I'm not sure. Nagy, Dubček, which is Czechoslovakia, Žilas, Yugoslavia, obviously, but instead from that of such radical communist theorists as Lukács, Gramsci, and perhaps most of all Rosa Luxemburg. Footnote. On this central issue, the Praxis Marxists can usefully be thought of as the Yugoslav analog, if not forerunner, of dissident communist tendencies in many other one-party states. The most prominent Soviet representative of this tendency is Roy Medvedev. See his book On Socialist Democracy. Although the Praxis Marxists do not share Medvedev's advocacy of multipartyism as an antidote to orthodox sectarianism. End footnote. On the broader socio-political plane, the consistent and thorough realization of the goal of workers' self-management was the overriding passion of the Praxis theorists. Perhaps none of them has written so extensively and provocatively on this theme as Mihailo Marković, and a close examination of Marković's work reveals a very definite political program in this regard. Marković's proposal to create independent information centers for the formulation of decisional alternatives for self-managing units was briefly noted in preceding pages. While the immediate goal of this innovation would be the democratization of economic decision-making, in the long term, in Marković's view, such impartial information centers would constitute an important step toward the systematic elimination of the sphere of professional alienated political activity. In its broad outlines, his blueprint for the deprofessionalization and democratization of politics shares the same optimism and some of the same faults, of Lenin's anti-bureaucratic realm of bookkeepers sketched out in the book State and Revolution. Markovich's bookkeepers, to be sure, are the instruments of the cybernetic age, quote, all routine administrative operations, end quote. Markovich asserts, quote, including the analysis of information and the search for optimal solutions within some given programs, will be performed much faster and in a more accurate way by electronic computers. A considerable part of the bureaucracy would thus lose any raison d'etre. End quote. Markovich. Yet these analytical functions, Markovich emphasizes, can and must be subject to strict popular control. Quote, even today, everybody could share in decision-making and management, and the present unlimited competences of the professional politicians could be reduced to the activity of experts who analyze data, propose alternative solutions, and work out practical measures, leaving to elected members of self-managing organs to adopt vital decisions, end quote. Markovich, From Affluence to Praxis, end footnote. And in order to instill these decision makers with a clear sense of value, as well as to counteract the dulling effect of the raw data that would be provided them, Markovich furthermore proposes the establishment of critical study groups within each self-managing collective and at all levels of social decision-making, itself a striking attempt to universalize the institutionalization of criticism beyond the relatively narrow boundaries of the humanist intelligentsia. In more general terms, Markovich seems to favor a Fabian-esque global strategy of what might best be described as, quote, creeping self-management, end quote. While Markovich warns that it would be a serious mistake to attempt to achieve the total democratization of modern industrialized society overnight, it is possible to commit oneself, in his words, to, quote, a series of continuous changes in all the microcells of society, which taken as a whole could represent a discontinuous change of the total system. This has already happened once in history. The English bourgeois revolution was not made, but it nevertheless ended in 1688. Under the wing of feudal society, islands of new bourgeois society were, permitted to, and develop, the free cities. Today the universities, tomorrow the factories might similarly become the self-managing atoms from which the new democratic socialist society will be constituted. End quote. Markovich. Markovich's optimism, to be sure, should be tempered by the observation that democracy confronts different types of obstacles in industrial and educational settings. But irrespective of these different contexts, democracy is predicated everywhere in both East and West on the cultivation of the questioning critical mind. This consideration, rather than any specific program of action in the political sphere, is the most important contribution which the Praxis Marxists have to offer to democratic theory in general, as well as to the development of socialism in Yugoslavia. As Supek cautioned in a 1972 newspaper interview, quote, when we talk about the relationship of philosophers and of the Praxis group toward politics, I would put the accent not on those activities which we perform as citizens who live in specific organizations, where we can be concerned about the practical problems of our system's functioning, but on problems of social consciousness and a socialist direction for which we as intellectuals are directly responsible. End quote. Supek. Indeed, when closely examined, even the, quote, political platforms advocated by thinkers such as Stoyanovich, Tadic, and Markovich deal with institutional questions only insofar as institutions such as the party or the, quote, technocracy infringe on the free development of a socialist culture adequate to the demands of the new society. No more than Rudy Supek has articulated so clearly and persistently the need for a vigorous socialist culture, Supek's concern over the lack of a genuine, quote, struggle of opinions, unquote, in the Pogledi period, and his long-standing demand for self-management in the spheres of cultural production and distribution formed the basis of his numerous Praxis essays on the problem of socialist culture. For him, this has been the central problem of socialism in the post-revolutionary stage. Quote, the goal of socialist culture, end quote, Supek wrote in an early article, quote, is to make man free, end quote. Supek. This socialist culture is distinguished above all by its critical content, which affirms future possibilities derived from the present as well as representing, quote, a merciless analysis and condemnation of all forms of inhumanity and dehumanization, end quote. Supek. Such an understanding of socialist culture is inconsistent with the notion of, quote, Marxist education, end quote, which in Supek's words, quote, in the spirit of the theory of reflection, operates through the mechanism of conditioned reflex, bracket, believing that, bracket, it is enough to repeat one thing constantly in order for people to adopt it without any consideration of the critical relationship of the individual towards reality, end quote. Supek. It encourages instead what we might call with Tadic a, quote, negative, quote, pedagogy, end quote, which cultivates the critical faculty and whose primary goal is to present the, quote, student with a total view of the world in which he lives. It calls for a science of society which discovers what is rational in human relations and which shatters ideological myths surrounding relationships of exploitation and power, rather than a science which complacently observes and describes in the blissful state of value neutrality, absolving itself of all social responsibility. Footnote. Regrettably, I've been unable to devote much specific attention to Praxis thought on this very important question within the confines of this study. In general, the, quote, critique of politics, end quote, outlined in chapters 3 and 4 is a living example of the type of, quote, science which the Praxis Marxists would like to see pursued in the humanistic disciplines. They have also published a number of essays critical of the direction of contemporary social science in Yugoslavia. Among the most noteworthy of these are, and it's like a something, bunch of things that are not translated into English. Ivan Kovacic has also written extensively on Western, primarily American sociology. See also Bozidar Yaksic's article, Culture and Development of the Contemporary Yugoslav Society, published in Praxis International Edition, 1971. End footnote. And perhaps most importantly, it is a call for openness and dialogue in the sphere of culture in the place of bureaucratic rigidity and dogmatism. As Supek argues, quote, without the freedom of cultural action, ... it would be impossible to arrive at a conception of the new socialist culture and the new profile of man, end quote. Supek. To be sure, this approach to culture is itself thoroughly political in nature, although on a higher plane of politics than the everyday pursuit of political power. While it calls for autonomy in the creation and articulation of cultural values, it understands those values as intimately related to the kind and quality of social life enjoyed by the members of a community. It is this kind of culture which the Enlightenment philosophers represented in their time and whose impact, it would seem, has been virtually dissipated by the sheer diversity of mass culture characteristic of post-industrial society. In the countries of Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world, however, where the articulation of alternate cultural symbols and values is heavily regulated by the ruling political elites, the, quote, word seems to have retained its former political significance. Here, official repression and popular discontent stirred by the catalyst of intellectual dissidents have often combined in an explosive compound. Modern Yugoslavia seems to represent an unstable cross between these two polarities. Appeals for the open, quote, struggle of opinions, end quote, somewhat modified in the mid-1960s by the ideology of the economic reforms encouraging the struggle of opinions in the marketplace, have competed with the periodic reassertion of the hegemony of the ruling political institutions at times of real or perceived social crisis. The relatively open ideological situation in Yugoslavia in the early 1950s, when the freedom of cultural creativity was formally embraced in official theory and to a limited extent encouraged in practice as well, stimulated the critical intelligentsia to seek new and more daring avenues in which to challenge official symbols. As a consequence, philosophy and social theory became the new battleground in the struggle for cultural hegemony, and the open advocacy of criticism gradually acquired a respectability, if not always an acceptability unparalleled in the other countries of Eastern Europe. In all this, the journal Praxis, it is this study's main contention, played a vital role, offering the proponents of criticism a concrete sense of their own identity. To some outsiders, especially in the political sphere, the journal became a symbol of intellectual recalcitrance and, even more threateningly, a political opposition. But it was the same journal, however paradoxically, which also offered the Praxis intellectuals a measure of protection as well. For the regime, in its eagerness to present the appearance of encouraging the free discussion of views, particularly those that were undeniably Marxist in character, long displayed a reluctance at decisive moments to force Praxis to cease publication altogether or to invoke severe sanctions against its adherents. As we have seen in the period following the 1974 League of Communists 10th Congress, this situation changed dramatically as official Yugoslavia prepared to unify itself for life after Tito. At that time, it seemed that the degree of the Praxis Marxist future success in continuing their public criticism would be a revealing indication of the path Yugoslavia would follow in the post-Tito era toward a new strengthening of one-party rule and a partial or total negation of Yugoslavia's achievements of the past 30 years, or toward further revolutionary social transformation, true to the spirit of its previous history of socialist experimentation. With the closing of Praxis and the repressive measures against Praxis's contributors, these are only among the most publicized in a series of acts directed toward consolidation of the regime's overall control, the shape of Yugoslavia's future seems somewhat clearer than before. What of Praxis's impact? In seeking an answer to this question, it is first necessary to note that Praxis's immediate audience was rather small. In the court decisions on the 1971 bannings, for instance, both the district and Supreme Court judges seemed somewhat mollified by the fact that the 3 to 4 1971 issue had been printed in only 3,000 copies and could hardly have been considered a massive assault on Yugoslav public opinion. Not only was Praxis's readership small, it was very select as well, consisting principally of other philosophers and sociologists, a segment of the general university population, and the bureaucracy. In the words of the district court's opinion of August 1971, quote, "It is obvious that the number of persons who familiarize themselves regularly with the content of this philosophical bi-monthly is quite limited. According to the testimony of witness Gajo Petrovic, its subscribers are members of the Croatian and Philosophical Society, while it is also received by the highest political representatives as well as by the libraries of the LCY Central Committee, the Central Committee of the Republican Leagues of Communists, and the leadership of the trade unions, youth, and socialist alliance organizations, end quote. District Court of the District Court. I don't know. This court statement, intended to minimize the extent of Praxis's immediate influence, nevertheless contained an important clue to the question of its overall effect on Yugoslav social life. The types of readers mentioned here were not, after all, representative of a broad cross-section of Yugoslav society. Instead, the readers of Praxis derived, for the most part, from political, cultural, and educational elites responsible either for the making of decisions vital to Yugoslavia's future, or perhaps even more important, for the preparation of its future leaders. The Praxis group's ability to reach beyond these social strata to the general public was impaired not only by restrictions on public appearances or blacklists maintained by the mass media, but also by virtue of the high social position which its members occupied in the most prestigious institutions of learning in the country, the lofty theoretical level of their published works, and the relatively restricted orientation and appeal of their journal. While the universalization of the critical consciousness may have been the Praxis Marxist ultimate goal, Praxis itself may be seen as having had, not necessarily by design, a more modest role in Yugoslav social life. To engage in an unremitting dialogue with the bureaucracy, to wage a practical struggle to legitimize unofficial intra-party Marxist criticism, and to provide a forum for the open and rational discussion of unorthodox ideas by otherwise, quote, mainstream and, quote, thinkers, whose initial exposition may not have been welcome within the ranks of the organized institutions of social power. Footnote. This distinction between the immediate goals of Praxis and the long-term goals of its contributors is reflected in the 1964 editorial preface to the first issue. Quote, if our journal, quote, appropriates and, quote, a right to criticism that is limited by nothing except the nature of the object of criticism, this does not mean that we seek a privileged position for ourselves. We feel that the, quote, privilege of free criticism should be universal, end quote. Even one of Praxis's most prominent archenemies, Mika Tripalo, was compelled to acknowledge Praxis's success in achieving these objectives when in 1966, at the height of one of the many anti-Praxis campaigns, he stated that the, quote, merit of Praxis is to have provoked all of us, and perhaps even the League of Communists, to an intensive theoretical discussion on a number of open questions, end quote. Mika Tripalo. Of this semi-incestuous relationship with the bureaucracy, several Praxis Marxists seem to have been more or less aware. Danko Grilic, for one, once observed that the bureaucracy, imperfect as it is, does have, quote, pores, through which opinions expressed in critical journals can penetrate, at least until such a time as adequate precautions are taken to protect the bureaucracy's ideological integrity and to shut off the flow of ideas. And Milan Životić has spoken reproachfully of a, quote, illusion apparently shared by some of his Praxis colleagues that, quote, we need merely offer a model of genuine true socialism to the bearers of bureaucratic resistance to the development of self-management, and they would accept that model sooner or later. There were illusions that in this manner of enlightenment, by pointing the way to a genuine socialism, it would be possible to influence the bearers of political bureaucracy, end quote. To Životić, and most likely to others as well, the repressive aftermath of the student revolt of 1968, culminating in the drastic anti-Praxis measures of early 1975, must surely have demonstrated that such an illusion, if in fact it was ever openly shared in exactly this form, was indeed hopeless. For their part, there were times when the Yugoslav rulers seemed to have been aware that, as Leszek Kolakowski has observed, quote, the spiritual domination of any class over the people, far more than its material domination, depends on its bonds with the intelligentsia, end quote. Leszek Kolakowski. That's in the book Toward a Marxist Humanism. In times of crisis, the ruling elites did, in fact, recognize, if only obliquely, the strategic importance of the Praxis intellectuals, as in the wake of the 1971 nationalist outburst in Croatia. There have also been indirect echoes of several Praxis theses and statements of official position, and even in far-reaching policies adopted by the government. The anti-statist rhetoric of Praxis has been absorbed by such eminent regime theoreticians as Cardell and was even utilized, ironically, in defense of the controversial 1970 to 71 constitutional amendments decentralizing the Federation. Similarly, Praxis's appeal for a thorough application of the principle of worker self-management, perhaps its central political prescription of lasting significance, was clearly reflected in the language of the new Yugoslav constitution adopted in early 1974. Footnote. See, for instance, Edvard Cardell's article, Principal Causes and Trends of Constitutional Changes, published in Socialist Thought and Praxis, Socialist Thought and Practice, May 1973. End footnote. To be sure, those ideas which the Yugoslav government did appropriate from the Marxist humanist intelligentsia were carefully tailored to the needs of the ruling elites, while their original proponents were characteristically denounced all the more vigorously as, quote, anti-socialist in order to set a healthy distance between the source of those ideas and the final result. Nevertheless, there was a constant interplay between the radical Marxist and the bureaucracy, for both were aware, and to a certain extent continue to recognize, that they originally issued from the same political culture and social conditions. This circumstance gave birth to a bizarre symbiotic relationship between the two major ideological offshoots of the Yugoslav Revolution, excluding the Stalinists, each of which seemed to depend on the other for the sake of its own legitimacy. For many years, the bureaucracy seemed to have feared that by decisively rejecting the radical Marxist critics, it would produce itself irreparable political damage in the eyes of socialist and liberal public opinion, not only in Yugoslavia, but in areas well beyond its boundaries. Subsequent events seem to have borne this out. The Praxis Marxist, in turn, aware of the dangers of reification and institutionalization, which belie all radical social movements, had a convenient target for precisely such charges in the bureaucracy. At the very least, the bureaucracy spoke a shared political language with the Praxis Marxists, and it responded to their criticism in a manner which seems to have proved that the two parties inhabited a shared symbolic universe. The conflict between Praxis and the bureaucracy represented, in more general terms, a fundamental clash between two rival political cultures with common roots in the Yugoslav revolutionary experience. And even in the light of all the bitterness and disillusionment caused by the government's repressive course of action, embarked upon in the early 1970s, neither side yet seems willing to take the final step of renouncing their common heritage. The Zagreb literary critic and Praxis sympathizer Milan Miric spoke in the late 1960s of, quote, reservations for thought and action, end quote, which in his view characterized the cultural political situation in Yugoslavia. These, quote, reservations were areas of relatively free activity whose impact was confined by the bureaucracy and the more impersonal forces of the marketplace within fairly well-defined boundaries. For the workers, their, quote, reservation lay in the domain of a parcelized system of self-management, while the, quote, reservation of the intelligentsia consisted of, quote, journals around which they gather, their books, their professional and protest meetings, their offices and institutes in which they act. Their reservation is all which by its true nature should be directed toward the destruction of every constraint, and which should revolt before the slightest suggestion of conformity from within, much less the sense of imprisonment which arises as a result of institutional pressure from without, end quote. Until the demise of Praxis, the idea of an invisible, quote, reservation, end quote, for the intelligentsia was quite appealing in the amount of light it shed on the situation of the Praxis Marxist and on Praxis itself as an institution of criticism. The Praxis Marxist indeed resided in a separate sphere of social action, aspire as they might have to penetrate to the broader public consciousness. In part, their isolation was imposed by the bureaucracy through repression, public misinformation and the attempt to portray them as hopelessly abstract theorists whose active intervention in public affairs could only have had disastrous consequences. These tactics seem to have enjoyed a limited degree of success outside of the academic community. Within the university, however, and especially among the students as well as the academic professions, for all its efforts, the regime was remarkably unable to tarnish the reputation of the Praxis Marxists or to gain widespread acceptance of its final desperate acts to remove their influence altogether. What the, quote, reservations idea did not adequately convey was that the isolation of the Praxis Marxists was to a significant degree self-imposed as well. Their principal refusal to lower themselves to the plane of everyday political combat was perhaps most important in this regard, for in addition to matters of principle, the Praxis Marxists were keenly aware that to engage in this sort of activity would have exposed them to dangers far more serious than those which they actually encountered. The enterprise that was Praxis represented no less than an only half-disguised attempt to institutionalize social criticism by providing for it a secure harbor where it could be protected from precisely the dangers of political institutionalization, which its adherents most feared. Yet perhaps their natural resistance to any suggestion that Praxis belonged in the category of, quote, institutions blinded the Praxis Marxists to their main purpose, causing them to mistake tactical issues for matters of principle. Thus, the frequently employed institutional self-defense that the assertions contained in Praxis were, quote, only theoretical, ultimately took on a reality accepted all too readily by friends and foes of Praxis alike, while the larger social mission of Praxis's critical theory came to be obscured by a misconception for which the Praxis Marxists themselves bore a significant burden of responsibility. These travails of the modern radical Marxist intelligentsia in Yugoslavia, when viewed in a larger historical framework, seem but to confirm the tragic fate of all intellectual movements whose quest for justice is at some point comes into conflict with their commitment to principle. In the words of Victor Brombaert, writing of the French tradition of the, quote, literary hero, end quote, for his condemnation of bad faith, is inextricably bound up with the tragic awareness of his own guilt and complicity. Obsessed by the suffering of others, convinced that man's salvation lies in solidarity, he is equally convinced of the walled-in nature of human consciousness and paralyzed by his very lucidity. Dreaming of his high social and spiritual mission, he knows his efforts doomed to defeat, yet blames himself for his own futility. Concerned with the regeneration of mankind, driven on by the urge to speak for and with others, he also flirts with the catastrophe and yearns for his own destruction. He is in fact the hero, the victim, and the buffoon of a tortured era, which has experienced politics as tragedy, freedom as necessity, and where history has assumed the urgent voice of a fatum. End quote. This existential despair, however, is not characteristic of the Praxis Marxists, who remained firmly committed to the positive task of creating the cultural basis for the new society. Well aware of the dangers of bureaucratization inherent in the process of direct social change, they are convinced that only a strong critical sense of public awareness will be capable of resisting these trends. So long as this public consciousness is still young and fragile, Markovitch asserts, quote, the most important means are truth, bold demystification of existing social relationships, discernment of deified persons and institutions, and above all, a great moral strength, ... What is needed in this phase is a critical science, a new revolutionary culture, a powerful democratic public opinion, above all, a new morality. A new morality is needed, a morality of human dignity, solidarity, stoic persistence, and spiritual superiority which can struggle with a strong material force. End quote. Markovitch, From Affluence to Praxis. As the history of the Praxis Marxists suggests, the bearers of such a, quote, new revolutionary culture, end quote, may find themselves in a highly vulnerable position by virtue of their isolation and the very scope of their ambitions. They may be perceived popularly and not perhaps without some reason as cultural elitists who do not feel that the masses by themselves are capable of attaining the moral heights of the new socialist man, while by the political elite they may be suspected of harboring sentiments antithetical to the very basis of the social order. The Praxis Marxists have met this challenge fully conscious of these pitfalls and hopeful that with time the necessity for a critical vanguard will itself be abolished. In the eloquent words of Mihailo Markovich, quote, by working for them, ultimately quote, by working for them, ultimate revolutionary goals, Gerson S. Sher, by participating in the creation of a new faith of millions of people, we take an enormous responsibility. There is no certainty that our undertaking will not bring about a considerably different society from the one anticipated, or raise quite new and unsuspected problems, or eventually turn out to be a tragic defeat in the loss of noblest human energy. However, only by taking such a risk can we consciously create possibilities which could never be brought to life by blind economic and social forces, end quote. Markovich, From Affluence to Praxis. Quote, the problem of the intelligentsia in socialism, end quote, writes Lyubomir Tadich, quote, is part of the more general problem of the tasks unaccomplished by the socialist revolution. Is a question primarily of socialist praxis that has not succeeded in facing up to political alienation. The return of the legitimacy of negative reason, constitutes one of the essential elements of the socialist renaissance. End quote. The Yubomir, I don't know if I'm saying that right. It's funny, I'm finishing the book, this is the last page, and I still don't know how to pronounce any of these people's names. The Lyubomir Tadich. The question of intellectual responsibility then dissolves into the much more far-reaching question of the responsibility of a society to that society's own ideals. And to this question, not even the Praxis Marxists have found a ready answer. And that is the end of the conclusion to Praxis on Marxist Criticism and Dissent in Socialist Yugoslavia by Gerson S. Sher. And that's also the end of the book. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you got something out of it.